on your notes, it shows you right here the vocabulary. What you are dividing by is called a divisor. What's underneath the division sign is called a dividend. The answer is called a quotient. Does 6 divide into 24? How do we know? If you divided that, what would the answer be? You would do 6 times 4 is 24, and you would subtract it, and it would have a remainder of 0. If you divided 5 into 24, how many times does 5 go into 24? 4 times 5 would be 20, and you would subtract, and you would have a remainder, right? And so, because there is a remainder, 5 does not divide evenly into 24. These are all pre-knowledge that you're supposed to have before we start our lesson today. So, example number 1 in your notes is all completely worked out for you, and I'm not going to go over that one again. We're going to look at example number 2. So I can show you step by step what they did in order to get the answer. If this is a factor of this, when you divide it, the answer is 0. The remainder is 0. That's how you tell if something is a factor, if it divides into it evenly with no remainder. So, polynomial long division looks like this. X plus 4 divides into x squared plus 6x plus 8. The x plus 4 is the divisor. The quadratic underneath is the dividend. So, please also notice that in our long division that we did with numbers, everything is divided up into columns. You have the column that represents the ones place and the tens place and the hundreds place and the thousandth place. Well, when I have polynomial division, this is the constant without an x, the x to the first power and x squared, and then you would keep going up in powers if you had a bigger problem. What do I multiply x by to make it equal to x squared? And that goes over the x column. So, the x multiplies by the x, and that's equal to x squared. The x multiplies by the 4, and that makes a 4x. And then you need to subtract, just like you did with whole numbers. X squared subtract x squared cancels out. 6 subtract 4 is 2x. Just like in your whole number division, you bring down the next term. What do I need to multiply x by so that it would be equal to 2x? So 2 times x, oops, I went off the screen. 2 times x is 2x. 2 times 4 is 8. And then I need to subtract. 2 subtract 2 cancels out. 8 subtract 8 is 0. The original question was determine if x plus 4 is a factor. If the answer is a 0, x plus 4 is a factor, because the answer on my division problem was a 0. Part B is asking the same question. Is x plus 4 a factor of this polynomial? Does x plus 4 divide evenly into x to the third power plus 3x squared minus 6x minus 7? What am I going to need to multiply x by so it will equal x to the third power? The x squared multiplies by the x, and that gives me x to the third power. The x squared multiplies by the 4, and that gives me 4x squared. And then I need to subtract. The x to the third powers cancel out, and this is going to be minus 1x squared. Bring down the next term. What am I going to need to multiply the x by so it's going to equal negative 1x squared? Negative x or negative 1x. Negative 1 times positive 1 is negative 1. X times x is x squared. Negative 1 times 4 is minus 4. X times that is x. And how do you subtract negatives? What's minus a negative? Minus a negative becomes a positive. Negative 6 minus a minus 4, when you subtract a negative, it becomes positive. These cancel out. Negative 6 plus 4, because when you subtract a negative, negative changes to positive. This would be a minus 2x. Bring down the next term. What am I going to need to multiply x by so it's equal to negative 2x? Well, I already have an x, so I need to multiply by negative 2. Negative 2 times x is negative 2x. Negative 2 times 4 is negative 8. To subtract a negative, you change the signs and add them up. The 2's cancel. Negative 7 plus 8 has a remainder of 1. If the remainder is not 0, then x plus 4 is not a factor of the original equation. X plus 4 is not a factor of this polynomial. Example 3. The 2x minus 5 divides into 2x to the third power minus 9x squared. Stop. Does this have an x to the first power? But in my dividing, I need an x to the first power to keep my columns all lined up. So in order to keep the columns lined up, I'm going to have to put in a 0x to the first power as a placeholder, or my columns will get messed up and it won't work out right. So if I am missing a term, you have to put in a 0 placeholder. Everybody got it written down correctly? What do I have to multiply 2 So it'll equal 2. Well, 2 already equals 2. X, and I need an x to the third power. That means I need to multiply by x squared. If I multiply x squared by that number, if I multiply x squared times 5, oh, but that's not 5, that's a negative 5. And then I need to subtract. To subtract a negative minus a minus makes that into a positive. And so when I add up the columns, I get negative 4x squared plus 0x, because I have to bring down that next term. What do I have to multiply 2 by so it's equal to 4? But it's negative, so I need to multiply by negative 2x. I'm going to multiply negative 2x times positive 2x. Negative 2 times negative 5 will make positive 10x. And I need to subtract. To subtract a negative minus a minus makes a positive. 0 subtract 10, bring down the next term. I need the 2 to go into negative 10. So I'm going to need to multiply by negative 5, because negative 5 times 2 would make negative 10x. Negative 5 times negative 5 makes a positive 25. To subtract a negative minus a minus makes a positive. And then over here I need to subtract a 25. 15 subtract 25 has a remainder of negative 10. Which negative 10? Okay, I'll go back in a minute, just because it's going to confuse everybody if I go back in the middle of the problem. And so I got it by multiplication to answer your question. And I'll show you that in a minute. Okay. This is the last example we're going to do in class today. What does this volume problem have to do with dividing? Because that's our topic for today, is dividing polynomials. Well, I'm assuming, it doesn't say, but I'm assuming from this problem that a carton is just a regular square carton. So the volume would be length times width times height. And it tells me this right here is the height. And it asks me for dimensions. What are dimensions? Well, they're the length times the width times the height. And if you know the height, you divide it into the volume to find the other two. So, even though it looks like a geometry problem, it's still a polynomial long division problem. You got it set up. What do I multiply x by so that's equal to 6x to the third power? To get this next row of numbers, you multiply the 6x squared times the x. What do you get when you multiply that together? You also must multiply this 6 times that term also. What is 6 times 6? And it has an x squared, and positive times negative makes this a negative. And then, just like in whole number division, you have to subtract. To subtract a negative, you have to minus a minus, and that would make a plus. Everybody clear on where I got the 6 and the 36 from? Add the column, and you get bring down the next number. Oh, that's easy. What do I need to multiply x by so it would equal to x squared? Well, I just need another x, so I'm going to multiply it by x. What am I going to multiply by x? I'm going to multiply that x times that x. I am also going to multiply this x times the 6. X times 6 is negative 6x. And then, just like in a whole number division, you subtract. But to subtract a negative minus a minus makes this into a positive. So what do I get on this next step? The x squareds cancel out. And you bring down the next number. What am I going to have to multiply x by so it's going to equal negative 35x so I can cancel out the 35? So negative 35 times x is negative 35x. Negative 35 times negative 6 is going to be a positive something. 6 times 5 is 30. You would carry the 3. 6 times 3 is 18. Plus 3 more is a positive 210. And then you have to subtract. To subtract the negative, minus a minus makes a plus. The 35s cancel out. And what about the 210s? They cancel out, and your remainder is 0. That means that this has to be a factor. Well, I know it is a factor because if it's a height, it has to be a factor because you get the volume by length times width times height. Now, this asks for the dimensions. This is the length. No, sorry, it was the height. It's the height. To get the length and the width, there's another step. You would have to factor the 6x squared plus x minus 35 by multiplying the first term by the last term and getting the factors of 210 and doing the factor by grouping. We're not going to do that part today. We're just going to focus on the dividing part because I want to give you time in class today to work on your homework paper. So,